All right, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always up for a good exploration.
This time, we're taking a look at, well, your annotated copy of Genesis.
Oh, interesting. Always love to see what stands out to people.
You sent over this Spanish version, 83800 space.pdf, and wow, there are some really intriguing highlights, especially in those early chapters. Seems like you're drawn to the big themes, huh? Creation, the fall, even the flood narrative.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how those stories, even after all these centuries, still resonate so deeply. They grapple with such fundamental questions about humanity, our place in the cosmos, our relationship with the divine.
Totally. Like you highlighted Genesis 1.7 to 8 and verse 11. Those powerful descriptions of God creating the heavens, separating the waters, commanding the earth to bring forth vegetation. What is it about those verses that stands out to you?
Well, the sheer audacity of it all.
Right.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's such a bold statement, a declaration. It sets the stage for everything that follows.
And it just grabs your attention, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then those verses you picked out, they emphasize God's absolute power, his authority, that repetition of, and it was so. It's not just stating a fact. It's highlighting the immediacy of God's creative acts. No hesitation, no struggle, just the spoken word, and boom, reality snaps into being.
It really makes you think about creation in a whole new light, the power behind it.
Absolutely. It offers a window into how those ancient writers understood the divine role in shaping the world around them. But then, of course, things take that dramatic turn in Genesis 3, the serpent, the fall. And this is where it gets really interesting. You've connected these verses to Moses 4.2325, almost like you're drawing parallels between the fall and the idea of spiritual death.
Whoa, that is an insightful connection.
It made me wonder about your own thoughts on this.
And you've highlighted Genesis 3.1424, the verses detailing the consequences of Adam and Eve's actions. What do you make of the serpent's curse and those loaded words, sorrow and tribulation, to describe humanity's future?
Well, let's start with that serpent. It's fascinating how snakes pop up again and again in mythology and literature. Symbols of chaos, temptation, even wisdom. But here in Genesis, that curse to crawl on its belly and eat dust, it's not just a physical punishment. It's a symbolic representation of being cast down, existing in a state of degradation.
A fall from grace, just like Adam and Eve's own expulsion from Eden.
Exactly. And then those words, sorrow and tribulation, they speak to the profound weight now placed upon humanity. Life outside the garden is not going to be easy. It'll be marked by struggle, pain, the constant awareness of our own mortality.
And this is where that connection to Moses becomes even more profound. Seeing the fall is not just a physical event, but a spiritual one. Those verses in Moses take on a whole new meaning, don't they? It's that idea of being separated from God, alienated from the divine.
A universal theme, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
That yearning for connection, for wholeness. It's something that resonates across cultures and throughout time.
Totally. And that brings us perfectly to your next set of annotations. You jumped ahead to the flood narrative in Genesis 6 to 9, specifically Genesis 6.1 verse 17, the verses where God gives Noah those instructions for building the ark and then chills, shuts him in. What do you make of that image, that finality?
It's always stuck with me, that image. It's like you can almost hear that door slamming shut. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are irreversible.
And it really highlights the duality, right? God's justice and mercy existing side by side.
Absolutely. God sees the wickedness of humanity. He feels compelled to act. And yet he provides a way for a remnant to survive. He's not wiping the slate completely clean. There's this thread of hope woven through the judgment.
It's interesting how you phrase that, compelled to act. Like, even for God, judgment isn't a choice, but a necessity.
It raises those big, timeless questions about divine justice, doesn't it? How do we reconcile a God who is all-loving with a God who allows for suffering and destruction? The flood narrative is often at the very heart of that debate.
It's a complex issue, for sure. No easy answers. And it really speaks to that multifaceted nature of God that we see throughout Genesis. He's not one-dimensional. He's a being of immense power, capable of great wrath, incredible compassion. Now, from the sweeping destruction of the flood, you shifted gears a bit in your annotations, zeroed in on a single figure, Abraham. Your markings in Genesis 11.28, 12.7, especially around his travels and the building of altars, they really make me think you're intrigued by this pivotal figure.
It's such a shift in the narrative, isn't it? We go from a story about humanity as a whole to this very specific journey of one man and his descendants, and this is where that concept of covenant really takes root.
And you specifically link these verses to the Abrahamic covenant, which seems to be a recurring point of interest for you.
Definitely a cornerstone of biblical theology.
Absolutely. But for our listeners who might not be as familiar, can we unpack that a bit? Why is this covenant so important for understanding not just Genesis, but the whole big picture of the Bible?
It's really a promise at its core, a multifaceted promise from God to Abraham and his descendants. Land, descendants as numerous as the stars, a unique relationship with God. And it's a promise that echoes throughout the entire Bible, shaping the destiny of nations and ultimately paving the way for the coming of a Messiah.
It's like you're establishing a lineage of faith, this direct line from Abraham to the later prophets and eventually to Jesus.
It's a powerful thread that connects so much of the biblical narrative. And it really highlights why understanding Genesis is so important. It's not just a standalone book, it's the foundation.
The cornerstone of our understanding. It's like we're putting together a giant puzzle, and Genesis provides those crucial first pieces. It's really incredible, isn't it? How these stories from Genesis, these narratives written thousands of years ago, still hold such power.
They really do. There's a timelessness to them, a depth of human experience.
Speaking of powerful narratives, we can't overlook the one you've highlighted here, the epic tale of Joseph, Genesis 37 to 50. Your annotations tell me you're really drawn to the emotional core of this story, the betrayal, forgiveness, that sense of divine providence.
Oh, absolutely. It's a story that stays with you. And it's complex, too. I mean, the way Joseph navigates his own family dynamics, the raw emotions, the jealousy, the betrayal, and then that eventual reconciliation, it's profound.
Absolutely. And you've highlighted several key moments, like that heart-wrenching scene in Genesis 37, where Joseph is sold into slavery by his own brothers. What is it about that act of betrayal that still resonates so strongly with us, even after all these centuries?
It's primal, isn't it? That fear of betrayal by the ones closest to you, the people who are supposed to love you, protect you. It's a fear that's woven into the very fabric of human experience.
It's a universal fear.
Exactly. And the fact that Joseph's story doesn't shy away from those dark emotions, the jealousy, the resentment that drives his brothers to such an act, it makes it all the more powerful.
That makes it real.
And yet, as you pointed out, there's so much more to the story than just that betrayal.
And that's what's incredible, right? You've also marked his rise to power in Egypt, culminating in that incredibly moving reunion scene in Genesis 45, 5:22. It's such a powerful moment, emotionally charged, especially that detail you caught, the fact that they didn't quarrel on their journey back to their father. What do you think that says about the power of forgiveness, particularly within a family dynamic?
It's such a small detail, isn't it? But so profound. It shows us that Joseph's forgiveness wasn't just about him letting go of the past. It actually transformed his brothers.
They're not the same people who left Canaan all those years ago.
Exactly. That jealousy, that bitterness, it's gone. It makes you contemplate the ripple effects of true forgiveness, how one person choosing to let go of anger and resentment can have this transformative impact, not just on themselves, but on everyone around them.
It's like forgiveness breaks those cycles of pain and retribution, creates space for something new to emerge, a really powerful message. Now, shifting gears a bit, you've also highlighted Jacob's blessing on Ephraim and Manasseh in Genesis 48:88-20. It's fascinating that you focused on the emphasis placed on the younger son being greater. Why do you think that detail resonated with you?
It challenges those traditional power structures, doesn't it? The way we think about inheritance, about who gets what. And it reminds us that God doesn't always operate within those human-made boxes of tradition and expectation.
It's that recurring theme in Genesis, right? God going against the grain, choosing the unexpected.
Like Abraham and Sarah, deemed too old to have children, yet chosen by God to become the parents of a nation. It reminds us that God operates from a different perspective, a perspective that often transcends our human understanding.
A higher perspective. And speaking of seeing things differently, you've made quite a few annotations about dreams and their interpretation throughout Genesis. It seems to be something that really piques your interest.
It's hard not to be captivated by that dreamlike quality woven throughout Genesis. Those moments where the veil between the physical and the spiritual seems to thin, and God communicates directly through these vivid, often enigmatic messages.
Those divine glimpses.
Yes, Jacob's ladder, Joseph's prophetic dreams. Dreams are embedded in the very fabric of the narrative.
It adds this element of mystery, wouldn't you say? This intrigue. And it makes you wonder, in our own lives, when we're searching for meaning, for guidance, for some sign, do we dismiss those promptings as mere coincidence? Or could they be something more?
It's a question worth pondering for sure. How do we discern God's voice in the midst of all the noise, all the distractions of everyday life.
It's a question that has echoed through the ages.
And maybe Genesis is suggesting that we need to be open, to listen, to pay attention to those whispers, those nudges, even in the most unexpected of places.
It's fascinating how Genesis shifts gears. You go from these grand, sweeping narratives of creation and covenant to this more focused look at the Israelites as a people, their identity, their relationship with the divine.
It's like the narrative zooms in, right? We're
Mhm.
getting a closer look at what makes this particular group of people unique, their practices, their beliefs.
It's like we're moving from the universal to the specific.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you pick up on a really key aspect of that, those themes of law and ritual purity. They become so central to Israelite identity.
It's more than just a set of roles, isn't it?
Right. It's about defining what's sacred, what's profane, and you highlighted a passage that speaks directly to that. Yeah. Exodus 30.30, where Aaron and his sons are consecrated as priests, set apart.
And you connected that to Leviticus 21.23, which talks about a priest with a defect being barred from approaching the altar. I'm curious, what's the thread that you're seeing between those two passages?
I think it highlights the idea of physical and spiritual wholeness. The priests, they weren't just religious officials, they were intermediaries between God and the people. Their very bodies were considered symbolic of that sacred role.
It's like their outward appearance had to reflect their inward state.
Exactly. And that emphasis on purity, on sanctity, it extended beyond just the priesthood. You also highlighted Leviticus 19.28, which forbids cutting one's body for the dead, and Leviticus 19.29, the warning against prostitution.
Two very different actions, but connected by a common thread.
It's about respecting the sanctity of the body, one's own body and the bodies of others.
It's a very different way of seeing things than we do in modern times.
It certainly makes you think, doesn't it, about how interconnected things really are, how our actions, even those that seem very personal, they have ripple effects.
It's that reminder that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves. A story that started long before us and will continue long after we're gone.
And that's the beauty of engaging with these ancient texts, isn't it? We start to see those connections, those echoes of the past in our own lives.
It's been an incredible journey exploring Genesis with you, from those grand narratives of creation to these very specific laws about how to live a holy life.
And you, dear listener, your annotations, they really demonstrate a genuine curiosity, a desire to not just understand the what, but the why of these stories.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
That Genesis is more than just an old book. It's a living tapestry of stories that still speaks to us today. It challenges us, inspires us, and yes, sometimes it even provokes us.
So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, allow these ancient stories to shape your own journey.
Because within these pages, you might just discover something profound about yourself, about humanity, and about the God who created it all.
And on that note, until next time, keep seeking, keep discovering, and keep diving deep.